So if I have said it once, I have said it 1,000 times. I think the makers of the What Would Jesus Do bracelets did not take this important story into consideration when they were making their product. It's a joke, but I think that there is also a bit more truth to it than we would like to admit. Because this is a text that shows that Jesus was greatly against commercializing the sacred. And it's a text that shows that Jesus was willing to show righteous anger when it needed to be shown. Which brings me back to those What Would Jesus Do bracelets. Just so I have an idea, if you know what it is, can you raise your hand if you've seen a What Would Jesus Do bracelet? All right, lots of hands up there, perfect. So these bracelets kind of flooded the market in the early 90s into the 2000s. I owned a black one and a red one after I lost my black one. And it was introduced, actually, by this youth director in Holland, Michigan, by the name of Janie Tinklenberg. And fun fact, it was never trademarked. So real quick, think of all the people who raised their hand. Think of how far we are from Michigan. She originally made 30 of these bracelets for her youth group. The idea was that she wanted them to be thinking throughout a month to wear this bracelet all the time for 1 month and think, when I'm in a situation, what would Jesus do if he was in my place? And so I did do a quick Google search, and fun fact is I did not find that any one of those kids ever went on a rampage knocking over tables and crock pots at the church bake sale. So, again, this one was missed. However, what did happen is that the word caught on. More people wanted them, and the company that made her original 30 has now produced over 16 million of these bracelets. Not to mention that there's also a huge number of books with that logo, shirts, sweatpants, shoes, sandals, even lunchboxes, if you so desire. And somewhere down the line, someone must have thought, well, if I make this product, I'm going to make Jesus more available to people, right? They thought, if I'm helping people to know Jesus more easily, that's a good thing. And if I make a few million while I'm at it, See, it was kind of this slippery slope from honoring Jesus to making it available and then down to profiting from it and commercializing this original excellent thought. It turns out that Wwjd bracelets have a lot more to do with this story at the temple than we might think, because the temple authorities had followed a pretty similar path. See, the temple in Jerusalem was an essential part of the Hebrew faith. It was the center of their religious tradition. It was where they believed that God dwelled among them. And during the Passover each year, people would go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Now, this might not be something that people did every year. Some people might do this every few years. Some people maybe once in a lifetime. But we do see in the beginning of Luke that Jesus and his family would go on an annual pilgrimage to the temple. So this was a regular thing that people would make this pilgrimage every year. And while they were there, for the Passover, they would offer a sacrifice to God. This might be a lamb, or if you were very poor, it might be a dove, but you were expected to make a sacrifice. Also, if you were a male, when you walked into the temple, you would have to pay the temple tax, which was roughly about a half shekel or 2 days' wage. But then as people started coming from further away, say they were coming in from Rome or from Turkey or Syria or that region, and they couldn't carry an animal that entire way, there needed to be something for them to do. In the same way, those people who were traveling from further off maybe didn't have the shekels that they needed in order to pay that temple tax that could only be paid in the currency of shekels. And so people were thinking, hey, we should, help out a little bit. So you have to imagine that at some point, some people were going to make their sacrifices, and someone set up a nice shop saying, here you go, you don't have to bring an animal with you, we'll have one right here with some nice unblemished lambs or doves. And then someone else thought it would be really helpful if they could just exchange their money right here. You don't have to go anywhere else. It's a one-stop shop. Quite possibly, all of these things that Jesus is attacking here could have been done with good intentions. They thought, I'm helping people honor God more easily, what if I can make a few denarii while I'm at it? Do you see what's happening here? Convenience and availability led to profit-making and greed. Next thing on the list would be the temple fast pass. Why wait in line? Show up, mark your spot, go enjoy your day in Jerusalem, and come at exactly the time that you have down. They had taken the most holy site, the holy place in which God lives, and they had capitalized on it. They had tried to make money instead of offering worship to God. And then Jesus enters the scene. Now, John is very different from the other Gospels. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus enters the temple and gives it this, rock star hotel room treatment at the end of his ministry, not at the beginning. In the other Gospels, he shows up just days before his death. But in John, Jesus shows up 3 times to the temple for Passover, and this is the very first time. So, it's drastically different when you look at the other Gospels. Either John is getting the order mixed up, or there's some timey-wimey change going on here, or John is trying to make a point. See, this passage comes immediately after the miracle at Cana. And as a reminder, that is the one when Jesus was prompted by his mother, and he produced this wonderful vintage of wine that was better than anything had ever tasted, that anyone had ever tasted, so that this poor and underfunded wedding feast could continue going on after they had run out of wine. And this was so that this bride and groom wouldn't be an embarrassment to their village. You had an obligation when you got married to have enough wine for your feast. To not is a terrible faux pas. You had to have the wine. And so when we place these 2 stories side by side, we see an immense difference between them. Jesus gives freely to those who are in need. The temple officials charge an entrance fee and a surcharge on your animals. In the first story, part of the chapter we see, the first part of this chapter, we see that Jesus shows the character of God. He is providing for those who are in need. And again, in this later half, when we see Jesus go on a rampage in the temple, we are also seeing the character of God. We see what happens when God sees people take advantage and appreciate the sacred space of that temple. See, Jesus walks into the temple, and I think it's interesting that he doesn't premeditate any of this. It doesn't say he walked in with a whip. He walked in, saw what was happening, picked up some cords, and just started working on it. Imagine what you would be doing if you were standing there, waiting to buy your lamb, and you see Jesus just making this whip right off in the corner. What was going to happen? He takes time to craft this, and then he unleashes some righteousness. Tables go flying, the sheep and the rams are run out, the birds are set free, the money is dumped out onto the floor. And I kind of wonder, what would I do if I were seeing this happen? What would you do? I would like to say that I would jump in, knock over a table, get in on it, but I don't think I would have. How easily do we settle into our routines, even when it comes to our faith? Sometimes especially when it comes to our faith. We settle into our own ways, even when we know, maybe that's not right. But why push against it? We grow accustomed to the way that things are. We accept them just as the way that it must be, and we fall into the sin of seeking comfort before we seek after justice. And that is why it is so important that this story shows the character of God. See, anybody who visited the temple could see what was going on was wrong. You could tell that this was not proper. These money changers and animal sellers weren't honoring the character of God with what they were doing. And in the same way, how often do we sit by, accepting things as just the way that they are, though we know that they are wrong? Maybe it's the institutionalized racism that penalizes people of color disproportionately to white people. Maybe it's the gun violence that seeps into our schools and into our universities. Maybe it's the worldwide hunger. Well, we sit with so much. And maybe it's staying quiet as someone says something demeaning of someone of another race, of another sexual orientation, of another belief. The fact is, what Jesus did do was not be silent and not be still. Instead, Jesus acted. And when the dust settled, the leaders came upon him, demanding a sign. Why would you have authority to do this thing? Jesus, we had tables set up here. They were marked. This is where they went. You don't just knock things over. And Jesus replies, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And no, he wasn't talking about the one that they were standing in. He meant the one that he was incarnate within. He meant that the Spirit of God was in him, and therefore he was a living, walking temple, the dwelling place of God, a tabernacle of flesh and blood. And he was pointing to the only sign that would matter in the end. If you want a sign, as great as the stories of miraculous feedings are, as great as the stories of Jesus healing the sick, of the great teachings that Jesus has, that is not the sign that he points to. No, he points to the sign of the sacrifice that was yet to come. He says down the line, in John's Gospel, years ahead of now, there will be a sacrifice that will end all sacrifices. And unlike within the temple, there would be no tax to pay. There would be no animal to purchase. Jesus, God dwelling among us, would be the willing sacrifice to free all who would accept it from the bondage of sin, death, and the devil. It's a sacrifice that would happen on a cross. But he says it right here. In 3 days, I will rebuild it. Jesus wouldn't stay down. 3 days later, he would rise, showing the sign of his power and his authority once and for all. To those who asked, what is the sign of you doing this? It was both the cross and the empty tomb. It is Jesus as God, offering us freedom and grace when we do not deserve either, because that is the character of God. Not profiting, not nickel and diming, not surcharging, or even offering to, just add a little bit on the top. Instead, Jesus offers even the likes of us a place to call home and a new heart and spirit within us. And he pays the price. So as we contemplate these bold actions and words of Jesus, as we ask ourselves, what would Jesus do here and now? Maybe we should ask ourselves instead, what is it that the risen Christ is already up to in our world today? And how might we join in alongside him? Amen.